It was a June afternoon. The sunlight scorched the square of Lakewood Springs like fire stretching over the sun-baked red bricks of summer. The air was thick with dust and sweat, but no one left. The crowd gathered around a crude wooden platform, not for justice, but for curiosity, for the worst instincts a society could foster. $20 for the last item of the day. The sheriff's voice rang out dry as the shatter of something once sacred. Young woman, 18 years old, healthy, obedient. Emily Carter stood on the platform, head bowed, tangled hair hiding most of her pale, hollow face. A fresh bruise still marked her left cheek, even under the harsh sunlight. She didn't cry. She didn't look at the murmuring, sneering crowd. Her eyes were a void, if anyone dared look directly into them. There were no tears left, only emptiness. Her parents' two gaunt figures with clouded eyes stood right below. They didn't shed a tear. No sign of pain or regret. Just vacancy, as if the souls they once had long been sold away, along with every stick of furniture that had left their crumbling shack last season. 25, a hoarse voice came from across the street. Travis Miller, the tavern owner, notorious for his eyes always wandering down women's backs, raised his hand, a crooked smile stretching to his collar. Emily shivered, her body recoiled half a step. 30. Another voice chimed in. Raymond Turner, a drunkard farmer once sued for beating his wife, though he'd never spent a day in jail. Amid the murmurs, one man stood silent at the crowd's edge. After 3 brutal drought seasons, Nathaniel Brooks, 42, is the only black man left with land in this area. His face was still, calloused hands clenched so tightly that his knuckles turned white. But what his eyes held wasn't disgust. It was an old pain, rising again. $50. Nathaniel's voice sounded calm, slow like a stone, tossed into the still lake of prejudice. The air froze. Every head turned a black man. Placing a bid, for a white girl, no one said a word. But the shock said it all. Emily's father squinted at Nathaniel, like looking at a stain on a white cloth. He growled, "I ain't giving my daughter to 70. Nathaniel stepped forward and dropped a small cloth pouch with real gold coins. The sheriff swallowed hard. "Mr. Brooks, I think you should—" "The law says any free man may place a bid," Nathaniel replied, eyes unwavering. "Unless you'd like to explain to a federal judge why you denied the highest offer." Emily lifted her head for the first time since she was brought to the platform. Her eyes, pale and silent, met his. No hope. No trust, only the weariness of a soul dragged too far for too long. $70 going once. No one else, 70 twice. A long silence stretched like it held 1,000 contemptuous breaths. Sold. The wooden gavel struck the platform, and fate at that very moment turned a new page. Not just for Emily, but for the entire town of Lakewood Springs. Nathaniel Brooks's wagon stopped at the square's edge, where the grass was yellowed by the summer heat, and the old wheels were caked in dust. He said nothing as he climbed down, adjusted the reins of his aging horse, then turned to look at Emily. She still stood on the platform, frozen without escort or guiding hand, as if shame had turned her to stone. "Let's go," he said softly, briefly. Emily stepped down. Quietly, people watched them as if witnessing something grotesque. They couldn't stop. Some whispered, some scoffed. A few children tossed pebbles at Nathaniel's back, but he didn't turn around. Emily walked half a step behind him, not because he told her to, but because that's how she had been trained since childhood. Women walk behind. Eyes down, no defiance. They reached the wagon. Nathaniel extended a hand. Emily hesitated, His hand was rough from labor, but not harsh. He didn't grip, he didn't pull, he left it there like a choice. Nothing more, no force. Emily stared at that hand as if it were a question she didn't know how to answer. Then she climbed into the wagon. As the wheels began to turn, murmurs rose behind them, buzzing like a wasp's nest struck by a stick. Sold his daughter to a damn Negro. $70 for something he won't keep long. Bet he's gonna use her like a man uses a woman. It wasn't the first time Nathaniel had heard such words, but for Emily they weren't insults. They were confirmed that she was no longer human, just something someone bought, and something the town would remember as a stain on the census. They traveled in silence. Fields stretched endlessly around them. Emily sat curled in a corner, staring down at her torn shoes. Sunlight filtered through her hair, revealing faded bruises and thin scars on her wrists, the kind a person learns to hide after being tied too often. Nathaniel glanced over, not out of curiosity, but because he noticed she wasn't trembling from fear of him. She was trembling from readiness. Readiness to be hit, to be used, to lose her name. He knew that feeling, the feeling of having nothing left worth keeping, and worse, the pain of knowing people were right to think that. "I won't hurt you," he said, voice low, just loud enough for her to hear. Emily turned to face him. Her eyes met his for the first time truly. No tears, no hope, just a flicker so faint like a candle barely burning inside a jar almost out of air. Why, she asked. Nathaniel paused, then replied, "Because I know what it feels like, to be treated like a thing." That sentence dropped between them like a thick blanket, covering every fury suspicion and label pinned on them just moments ago. And for a fleeting second, they were no longer a black man and a white girl. No longer buyer and bought, just two souls, priced, bruised, silenced so long they forgot they had voices. Finding each other on the same wagon headed for exile. Ahead lay 6 miles of dirt road, and beyond that, the home of a black widower where even the wind carried the cry of a child once lost. Emily didn't know what awaited her, but for the first time in years, she didn't feel alone. When the wagon came to a stop, the sun had dipped low. The horizon blazed red, turning withered oak branches into burnt arms, stretching toward forever. Nathaniel Brooks's farm emerged like a memory, long buried, small, isolated, and so silent the wind dared not breathe. Emily looked around. The wooden house wasn't big, but it stood firm. The porch roof had been recently repaired. A stone well sat nearby, moss gently clinging to its sides. Further out, a garden browned by drought where Nathaniel once planted hope, though rain never returned. "This is my home," he said, stepping down from the wagon. "It's not much, but it's mine, and here no one can bother you." Emily stayed seated. Her eyes swept the landscape like a trapped animal, sizing up its cage, marking escape routes, fences, and distances. She wasn't admiring. She was calculating her exit. "The room in the back used to belong to my son Nathaniel," continued without pressure. "It has a lock on the inside. If you want, you can use it." Emily froze. A private room, a lock, a simple sentence, yet in her world it was a rare luxury. She stepped down slowly, kept 3 paces behind, and said nothing. They entered the house. The door creaked open, releasing the scent of old wood and damp soil. A large wooden table sat in the middle. A lamp was already lit. Someone had been here. Nathaniel frowned. He walked over and scanned the room. "Don't worry," he said after a few seconds. It was Clara. Emily blinked. "Clara Jenkins. She left food." He nodded. "You know her?" Emily fell silent for a moment, then nodded gently. "She helped deliver my mother a long time ago." The air sank into stillness. 2 generations, 2 women, 2 wounds connected now by the same black midwife who'd once helped birth children into a world that would never protect them. Emily quietly examined the house. It didn't look like a place where someone had given up. Books lined up neatly on makeshift shelves, a desk with organized papers, a pressed shirt hangs beside the door. The kitchen tiles were clean and nothing was out of place. Everything was held together as if its owner refused to let life collapse again. "Were you a soldier?" she asked suddenly. Nathaniel shook his head. "I was a slave, then a free man, then a widower, now a gardener without rain." She didn't laugh, but something in her gaze softened. Dinner passed in silence, a simple stew and cold cornbread. Emily sat across from him, saying nothing, but not staring at the floor like before. She began to realize this man demanded nothing of her. No apology, no gratitude, not even respect. He let her exist. As they neared the end of the meal, Nathaniel set his spoon down. "You're planning to run tonight, aren't you?" Emily stiffened, her body stretched taut like a string about to snap. But he didn't wait for her reply. "I don't blame you. If I were you, I'd run too. But you should know there are 3 men out there hunting girls like you. They don't need reasons. All they need is a face they don't recognize, skin that's the wrong color, a name that isn't in the town ledger." "I'm not a slave," she snapped. "No," he nodded. "You're not. But try explaining that to men with guns and minds full of hate." Emily fell silent. And for the first time, genuine fear entered her eyes. Not fear of being hit, not fear of being sold or touched, but fear of vanishing, of being forgotten, of not being believed she ever existed. "The room has a lock," Nathaniel repeated. Then he stood up and walked to the porch, leaving the girl alone, not tied, not guarded, not watched. Freedom in its most fragile beginning. That night, Emily didn't sleep. The old room, once belonging to Eli Nathaniel's young son, still bore the imprints of a childhood that never had the chance to grow up. A small wooden toy car sat on a shelf a few pages from a children's book lay open and unfinished, and a crude graphite drawing titled "Me and Mama" hung crooked on the wall. Emily lay curled up on the wooden bed, her body instinctively pulled in like an old habit. Wind howled through the cracks in the door, carrying the scent of dry grass and sawdust. But it wasn't the wind that kept her awake. It was Nathaniel's words: "I used to be enslaved, then a free man, then a widower, now a gardener with no water." He wasn't asking for pity, he wasn't clinging to anything. But the sentence lodged in her chest like a small bone, too stubborn to swallow. Close to midnight, Emily quietly opened the door. She stepped outside. The house was still cloaked in darkness, except for a sliver of moonlight falling across the window. She had no clear purpose. Maybe she was looking for an exit. Maybe to see if anything of value was hidden here, money, a map, or food. She still didn't trust him, and she didn't blame herself for that. But the first thing she found wasn't gold. It was paper. A lot of paper. A copy of the federal land law book lay on the table, worn dog-eared and marked heavily with notes. Entire sections were underlined. Handwritten pencil notes filled the margins. Apply Section 6B, Land Protection Rights. Sullivan v. Harper, 1857. Counter's Forced Reclamation Clause. Beside it sat a stack of letters, all stamped with the seal, Boston University, Department of Law. She pulled one from the pile and read, "Mr. Brooks, your legal analysis regarding unlawful land reclamation mechanisms in southern states is remarkably accurate. I strongly urge you to consider publishing it as a formal paper." Sincerely, Henry Caldwell. Emily froze. A black man farmer, a gardener of parched soil living alone in the woods, corresponded with a renowned law professor from Boston. And more than that, he was writing about how to fight the legal frameworks of the white establishment. The man before her was no longer just poor Nathaniel Brooks, who had spent all his gold to bid on a girl. He was a quiet resistor. A man who studied law not to teach it, not to boast, but to protect the land that history had once stolen from his ancestors. Then came the sound of hooves outside. Emily startled, turning quickly. 3 horses approached. She immediately recognized Travis Miller, Raymond Turner, and a third man, tall, well-dressed, with a cold smile and eyes that held no human reflection. She slipped behind the curtain. Nathaniel had already risen now, stepping out and gently closing the door behind him. Mr. Brooks, Travis sneered. "We're here to introduce someone new to you. This is Judge Wallace Grant, personally appointed by Mayor Whitmore." The judge bowed slightly. "Mr. Brooks, I've heard a lot about you. Today we're conducting a routine land suitability inspection for the district." Nathaniel stood tall. His eyes remained calm. "My taxes are paid in full." "It's not about taxes anymore," Raymond said, his grin slick. "It's about appropriateness." "Unproductive land," Grant explained. "The government can reallocate it for higher use." Emily clenched her fists behind the curtain. She knew that tone, the voice of men who used the law to dress up theft. "This land has been mine since 1869, Nathaniel said flatly. "Certified deed, no changes." Travis burst out laughing. "Times change, Mr. Brooks. So do laws." The 3 horsemen rode off, leaving a trail of red dust behind them. Nathaniel remained still, not even turning around. Emily stepped out, her eyes flashing with something between fear and fury. "They're trying to take your land. They've always wanted it," she said, her voice low. Nathaniel didn't look at her. He said, "Because something here is worth more than a few acres of dry soil." She looked at him, not as a man who once bought her, but as an old comrade of loss. And in that moment, she decided she would not run anymore, not because she trusted him, but because she knew he wasn't lying. That afternoon, a covered wagon arrived at Nathaniel's farm. The driver was a stout, middle-aged woman, hair tucked under a dark brown scarf, eyes sharp like needles. She didn't knock. She called out Nathaniel. Emily watched from inside. The woman carried a sack of seeds, a basket of cornbread, and a tightly sealed oilcloth-wrapped letter. Clara Jenkins. There wasn't a soul in town who didn't know her name, a midwife to hundreds of babies, but also the living eyes and ears of every injustice in Lakewood Springs. She'd been there when Emily was born. She'd once carried Emily's mother in her arms after a beating, though no one was allowed to speak of it. Clara stepped into the house and looked Emily up and down, as if through a microscope. "You know me?" Emily asked cautiously. "You don't remember, but I wiped blood from your mother's forehead the night she birthed you," Clara said bluntly. "Mr. Collins didn't even know it'd be a girl back then." Emily looked down. What her father had done was undeniable. "Why are you here?" Nathaniel asked, placing a hand on the letter. Clara glanced at Emily, then handed it over. "This came from the telegraph station," Samuel said, "to deliver by hand. No middlemen." Nathaniel opened the letter. His eyes moved across the lines. With each word, his face grew colder. When he finished, he folded it and exhaled. Then he turned to Emily. "Did you ever overhear anything during your father's meetings with Mayor Whitmore?" Emily froze. Fear flickered in her eyes, not because of Nathaniel, but because she hadn't expected him to know. Clara spoke gently. "You're not the first one we tried to get out of that family, but you're the first to live long enough to tell the story." Emily tightened her grip. In that moment, her left shoe made a faint click. Nathaniel glanced down. "What are you hiding in your shoe?" Emily hesitated for a beat. Then she bent down, took it off. From inside the ragged insole, she pulled out a minor metal key. The head was carved with a dragon pattern. "This unlocks my father's desk drawer." She looked up. Her voice trembled, but it was clear. Inside there's a red-bound ledger. He wrote down names, payments, lands bought, and lands to be taken. And the railroad. Both Clara and Nathaniel stood still, not because they were shocked, but because they had suspected all along. They'd just never had proof. Emily went on, "My father didn't sell me because he was desperate. He did it to eliminate a liability." I knew too much. A single tear slid down her cheek. He once told me, "You don't need to know how to read, how to stay quiet." But I read anyway. I listened. I saw Judge Grant come to our house. I heard them planning to reroute the railroad through land they just bought back from colored families. Clara's wrinkled hands clenched, an entire generation taught to stay silent. Yet one girl eavesdropping is enough to shake an empire. Emily looked at her for the first time, not just with guarded eyes, but with the gaze of someone who understood. There was no going back. Nathaniel stepped forward, placing a hand on the still open letter. "What's in it?" Emily asked. He looked at her. Cold, deep, a copy of a notice from Boston. "The press is starting to pay attention, but we need proof." He looked down at the key in Emily's hand. "And I think you're the one who can get it." That night it rained unexpectedly. Lakewood Springs hadn't seen a drop of rain in 8 weeks. But as if the sky shielded someone's secret, the wet night poured over the town, blurring windows, washing away footprints, and dampening the vigilance of those who believed power would always protect them. Emily Carter, 18 years old, daughter of a powerful man, wore a dark cloak borrowed from Clara. In her hand was the minor metal key once hidden inside the lining of her shoe. Her eyes no longer trembled. There was only one thing left in them: absolute focus. While the townsfolk were still asleep, Emily slipped through the alley behind the old bakery where children used to play hide and seek, and crept along the rotting wooden fence that bordered the house that had once been a home, before it became a prison for silence. She knew every door, every branch. Her father used to hide a spare key beneath a horseshoe-shaped rock, but tonight she didn't need it. The real key was in her hand, symbolizing the one thing she had been forbidden: the right to know the truth. The house was pitch dark. No servants, no footsteps. The sound of rain drumming on the roof and the pendulum clock ticking like a heartbeat strained with tension. Emily opened the study door. The room was the same, tidy, cold, and devoid of a single family photograph. She walked to the desk. The bottom drawer is locked. Her hand trembled slightly. She inserted the key. Click. The drawer popped open. Inside one thick, red-bound ledger trimmed with leather. She pulled it out and flipped through its pages. What lay within was the raw, bloody proof of rot, a list of over 20 land plots acquired under the label "unfit for independent management." Signatures from Mayor Douglas Whitmore, Judge Wallace Grant, and her father Charles Collins. Maps showing altered railroad routes that bypassed white territories, cutting straight through black-owned land that had just been revoked. She pulled out a stack of thin papers tucked into the spine copies of fake transfer agreements stamped with the town seal. Most of the signatories were either dead or illiterate. Emily stuffed everything inside her cloak, relocked the drawer as it was, and stepped out of the house just as a bolt of lightning tore across the sky. She didn't know that a tall figure had seen her from an upstairs window. And though he couldn't be sure who it was, he knew something had just been taken forever. Meanwhile, on the other side of town, under the awning of the telegraph station, Nathaniel stood alone. His clothes were soaked. The tarp above him flapped like bat wings in the wind. Samuel Dean, the telegraph operator, a quiet white man, opened the door and nodded. "The line to Boston is ready." Nathaniel stepped inside. In his hand was a duplicate of what Emily had just retrieved. He typed, letter by letter, piece by piece, on the telegraph machine. Each click rang out like a charge of indictment traveling hundreds of miles away. By morning, before the town had fully awakened, the first sheets of paper appeared, pasted onto the church doors, the market, and the town hall. On them were revised maps. Names, signatures, an italic headline reads, "Evidence of systematic land appropriation under the guise of legalization." The town buzzed. Some ripped them down, some read in shock, some doubted. Others stood in silence. Mayor Whitmore slammed the desk in fury at the tavern office. "What the hell is going on? Those documents couldn't have disappeared." The drawer was locked. Judge Grant was sweating his tie, loosening by the second. "Only you had the key." "No one else," Montgomery Travis Miller muttered, using Nathaniel's old name, the one the town used to avoid calling him Mr. Brooks. "He's involved. I told you." "He's the thorn," Whitmore snapped. "A black farmer has no way into town hall." What they didn't know was that Emily, their daughter, was the one who had just placed the first brick in the collapse of the empire they had built on lies. At 10 o'clock, the church bell rang 3 long chimes. Lakewood Springs had never been so electrified. Young, old, white, and black people gathered in front of the town hall, the church, and the central market. The papers posted everywhere stormed down upon the mask of power. Like a sudden hurricane, land schematics rerouted railroad plans, forged contracts, and the part that stunned everyone: the names of the most trusted men in town. Meanwhile, 3 men stepped off the early train at the small train station on the outskirts of town: a representative from the Intercontinental Railway Company, a federal inspector from the Department of the Interior, and a journalist from the Boston Globe. As arranged through last night's telegram, Nathaniel Brooks led them, the black man the whole town had once treated as a stranger. At the same time, Emily Carter stepped out from the church, wearing a dark coat and carrying a bundle of documents. Walking beside her was Reverend Allen Pierce, his expression solemn, his eyes scanning the crowd like a signal. Something big is beginning. The crowd parted. No one laughed, no one yelled. Emily walked to the very center of the square, the exact spot where she had once been auctioned. Her father, Charles Collins, had just arrived. His face drained of color when he saw his daughter holding the red ledger he had once hidden in his drawer. He stood frozen, not in fear, but in disbelief that she would dare. Reverend Pierce spoke. "Ladies and gentlemen, the young woman beside me today is not just a victim. She is the living proof of truth, and truth will no longer be locked in anyone's drawer." Emily lifted her chin and looked her father straight in the eye. Her hand raised the red book. Her voice didn't tremble, it didn't burn with rage, it was clear, precise, sharp as a blade. "You sold me like a property, but the worst thing you ever did wasn't selling your daughter, it was selling the honor of this entire town." The crowd held its breath. "You signed the land seizure papers. You took money from those who wanted to erase black families. You promised Mayor Whitmore to keep it all quiet, as long as they let you live like a man of power." Charles Collins stepped forward, shouting, "You don't know anything. Your mother left because she couldn't stand a child like you. You were a burden from the day you were born." A slap of words. But Emily didn't lower her head. "No," she said softly. "She left because she was the first to realize you weren't worth protecting. And now I know it too. The federal inspector raised a hand to speak. Ladies and gentlemen, Mr. Collins's daughter has provided sufficient documentation to prove falsified land records, bribery of public officials, and collusion with a man previously disbarred for judicial misconduct, namely Mr. Wallace Grant, who currently serves as judge in this district. The crowd murmured. The journalist from Boston stepped forward, raising a telegram. We've confirmed with the Massachusetts Bar Association that Mr. Wallace Grant was expelled for document forgery. So how? Did he become a judge here, Mayor Douglas? Whitmore stepped out of the tavern, his face pale as chalk. You can't do this. I was elected. This whole town is mine. Was the railway representative replied coldly. Until we discovered your railroad maps were illegally altered to inflate the value of plots you just redistributed. That constitutes federal land fraud. Shouting erupted. The crowd swelled. Raymond Turner attempted to flee through the back exit, but found Sheriff Jensen blocking his path, hand resting lightly on his holster. It wasn't me, Turner stammered. It doesn't have to be all of you, Jensen replied, just enough to start. And then, amid all the chaos, a moment became history. Emily Carter, the girl once priced at $70 in the marketplace, stood in the middle of the square and spoke loudly. I used to think I wasn't worth anything, that I was just a product. But today, I understand the value of a human being is not in the price someone is willing to pay. It's in whether they stand up so that those who once silenced others must finally bow and listen to the truth. 6 weeks after the confrontation in the square, the ground once soaked in the dust of shame began to sprout new growth. The Intercontinental Railway Company, after completing a site survey, announced a decision that shook the entire town. The new railway line will run through the land legally owned by Mr. Nathaniel Brooks, due to its stable terrain and strategic location. The land they once sought to steal was now the centerpiece of progress. Nathaniel's humble wooden home, where once only 2 people dined in silence, had become a destination for townsfolk from neighboring counties. But what drew people wasn't money or land rights, but a wooden sign hung outside his door, hand-carved in charcoal black Freedom School. All colors, all backgrounds, all children. Emily no longer bore the name Collins. A simple marriage certificate signed by Reverend Alan Pierce and tied with a blue ribbon now records her name as Emily Montgomery. She didn't marry Nathaniel out of obligation, not out of debt, but because they 2 people long seen as society's blemishes had found in each other the one thing they had both been denied the choice to stand tall. The first class took place under the great oak tree, where its shade was wide enough to cover 8 children. 3 white, 4 black, and 1 Asian, the child of a brickmaker. No one asked where they came from. No one lined them up by category. Emily stood before the class holding a book with a broken spine, her voice steady. We don't learn to become someone else. We learn to remember that we belong on this land just as much as anyone else. Nathaniel sat behind the oak fixing a broken desk. When Emily glanced back at him, he only nodded, saying nothing. But his eyes said enough. I always knew you had fire inside you. You just needed a place to breathe. From all around, people began to come and learn. Not just children, but adults who had never gone to school. A 46-year-old carpenter came to know his ABCs. A white widow asked Emily to help write a letter to her son stationed at the front lines. The house that had once sheltered only a widowed man had become a place where people came to learn how to name themselves. And in a far corner, where the new train platform had just been built, a young man with a limp stepped onto the platform. He had once been mocked for having one leg shorter than the other, turned away from every opportunity. But today he wore a railway company uniform, his face beaming. When he saw Emily from afar, he waved and shouted, "Thank you, Miss Montgomery. They hired me for real." Emily smiled a genuine smile, light as morning sun. Beside her, an elderly woman who had once turned her back on Emily in the street whispered, "They would never have hired a boy like him, if it weren't for you." Emily replied softly, "I didn't do it alone." That evening, over a simple dinner shared with Clara Nathaniel Jenkins and even Sheriff Jensen, who had finally rediscovered himself, they read a new letter from Boston. Professor Henry Caldwell had officially sent confirmation the Montgomery Scholarship Program is approved. 15 university scholarships for minority youth from Lakewood Springs, sponsored by Boston University. The table fell quiet for a few seconds, then erupted with joy. Emily clenched her hands, looking up at Nathaniel's weathered ceiling, once the roof over a girl auctioned like property. Now, the shelter for 15 dreams handed the key to their future. The next morning, sunlight bathed the fields that had once cracked dry from drought. But this time, it didn't feel like desolation. It felt like a breath of beginning. Clara Jenkins had carefully placed a letter from Boston University in the center of the wooden table. Everyone gathered around, not as a council of power, but as a family. Nathaniel, Emily, Clara Jenkins, and Sheriff Jensen, who had stepped out of the shadow of silence to stand on the side of right. Emily opened the envelope, her hands trembling slightly. Inside was a neatly typed line, "We are pleased to confirm the Boston Law School agrees to sponsor the Montgomery program. 15 scholarships for minority youth from Lakewood Springs will take effect starting next semester. The project name Seeds of Change." Everyone sat quietly, not from confusion, but because so much had been endured to earn such a piece of paper. Emily gently touched the project name Seeds of Change. Outside the window, children ran around the makeshift wooden classroom. Laughter rang from beneath the oak tree, where only silence and the ghosts of prejudice had once lived. Not long after, a scholarship announcement ceremony was held at the town's new train station, where trains once passed, and no one from Lakewood Springs was allowed to board. This time was different. On a small makeshift wooden platform, Emily Montgomery, the woman who had once been priced at $70, like a commodity, stood and addressed the entire town. "We were once taught that knowledge wasn't for people like us, that there was no room in schools for children of color, for immigrants, for those without prestigious names. But today, from the place that once stripped us of our voices, we will raise a generation that knows how to speak the truth." She turned to look at the 15 teenagers standing behind her. Each carried a story: a boy from Haiti who hadn't learned to read until he was 10, a white girl whose mother was a maid shunned for being mixed, an Asian boy expelled for not pronouncing words correctly. They all wore school uniforms, each holding an acceptance letter from Boston University. They weren't charity. They were living proof that fairness isn't something we wait for. We have to open the door and step into it. Behind the stage, in a private conversation, Professor Henry Caldwell, who had initiated the scholarship, shook hands with Nathaniel. "I saw promise in you from the very first letter, but I never imagined what you would sow would become an entirely new ecosystem for the South." Nathaniel smiled. "We didn't sow hatred," he said. "We sowed the ability to see each other through different eyes." Later that day, Emily and Nathaniel sat together on the house's front steps, watching the children play in the yard. The evening breeze was gentle, carrying the scent of new books, pine, from the half-built desks, and hope, a thing no one could package, but everyone could feel. "Do you think 15 is enough?" Emily asked quietly. Nathaniel looked at her as if seeing Grace again, his late wife who once dreamed of a land where children didn't need police escorts to get to school. No, he said, 15 is just the beginning. The sun set slowly over the roof of the new train station. The first flickers of oil lamps began to glow behind the windows of wooden homes that once knew only the darkness of prejudice and silence. Emily Montgomery stood alone on the wooden platform in the schoolyard where the ground had been dry and cracked only months ago. In front of her sat 23 children in 2 rows under the great oak tree. Some with golden hair, some with deep brown skin, some with Asian features, even a few with Mexican heritage whose families had just moved here. After hearing this is a place where kids aren't kicked out of class for how they pronounce words. Emily took a deep breath, her eyes resting on a swirl of dust quietly drifting over an old crack in the earth. Right there was where she had once been auctioned off. Her voice rang out not loud, but each word seemed to echo into every forgotten corner of the town. No one asked what I wanted the day I stood on this wooden platform. No one thought I could think. They only asked, was I healthy? Was I obedient? And finally, how much was I worth? She paused. Small faces looked up at her, and in their eyes there was no fear. There was something more profound. Empathy, bone deep even if they were too young to name it. In that moment I didn't think about freedom. I only thought about revenge. I wanted people to hurt the way I had hurt. But then I met someone who didn't free me by cutting my chains, but by handing me a key to open the door myself. That night, as Emily and Nathaniel walked along the red dirt road leading from the schoolyard to their wooden house, the sky burned with a deep sunset. Nathaniel said, "They used to say we didn't belong here, that you were damaged goods, that I was a trespasser." Emily nodded, her eyes on the town where lantern lights now lined up like golden threads sewing back together a cloth once torn apart. "And we proved," she said slowly, "that a person's worth was never about how much someone was willing to pay." She turned to look at him, "but about what they're willing to stand up and protect, even when no one stands with them." A few weeks later, during a Monday morning lesson, Emily watched the children write their first sentences. A shy little girl sitting in the back raised her hand. "Miss, what does freedom mean?" Emily smiled. She sat down beside her eye level and replied, "Freedom isn't just the absence of chains. It's when you can sit at a desk that they once said you didn't deserve, and you don't have to ask permission to be there." The story of Emily Carter, the girl once auctioned off, and Nathaniel Brooks, the man once treated as an outsider, isn't just a tale of triumph over corruption, it is a new definition of justice. Justice isn't the end of darkness, it is the light we kindle, so others may find their way forward. The train station of Lakewood Springs, once just a sketch in someone's backroom scheme, was now a hub for trade, transport, and jobs. The Montgomery Freedom School, once just a class beneath a tree, had grown into a small campus with a library, classrooms, and dormitories for underprivileged students. As for Emily, she still teaches, still writes, still lights the way. And in every first lesson of a new year, she always begins with the same sentence, "They tried to break me." But then I realized what is broken sometimes reflects light better than what's left untouched.